for a place called Cancer Alley, based on the pre-existing model data, which we knew was insufficient, to find on-the-ground risks being that much higher, 10 times higher in some cases, is just a sobering result, and something that we're worried about how to reduce those risks for the people who live there.
Hey there, I'm Jesse Fox Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. This week we'll be talking science in Cancer Alley with Johns Hopkins University professors Pete DeCarlo and Keeve Nachman. That was DeCarlo we heard up top discussing a study the two of them led of air pollution along the infamous petrochemical heavy stretch of the Mississippi River corridor in Louisiana. They used new technology to sample and identify pollutants in the air there, and they found the presence of toxic chemicals is even worse than previously thought. That conversation is coming up, and in our Arts and Culture segment, we'll preview the great music festival Big Ears, which is happening right here in my hometown this week. First, it's time for the news roundup. This week, we're going to look at surprising pushback on immigration enforcement in Florida, a surge in Islamophobia among Southern legislators, and the cost of gun violence in Tennessee. As always, you can find links with sources and more information in the show notes. We'll start in Florida. Criticism of immigration enforcement efforts in the Sunshine State has been mounting over the past year from immigrants' rights groups and civil liberties groups, among others. But last week, concerns were raised by some less expected voices, a group of law enforcement officers appointed by state Republican leaders. The State Immigration Enforcement Council is made up of 4 sheriffs and 4 police chiefs from across Florida. It was created by the state legislature to provide advice and feedback on the state's avid cooperation with federal immigration efforts. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has said he wants the state to be the tip of the spear in working hand in hand with the Trump administration's mass deportation program. During the Enforcement Council's meeting on March 16th, the group's members emphasized that they continue to support and work closely with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the Border Patrol. But under an agenda item titled Policy and a Path Forward, they also offered some advice that enforcement efforts should focus on people who have committed crimes beyond just being in the country without documentation. Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd, who chairs the group, said he intends to write a letter to federal officials encouraging greater differentiation between the treatment of undocumented immigrants who have committed crimes and those who have not. He blamed Congress for failing to create pathways for people to gain legal status, saying, quote, "While Congress sits on their hands and does nothing about this, we are on the ground floor with this day in and day out, looking in the eyes of these folks that, yes, came here inappropriately, but some came here inappropriately only to do better for themselves and their family," unquote. Other members of the council echoed Judd's concerns and said they, too, would sign the letter. The advisory group has no direct policymaking power, but any reservations about aggressive ICE and Border Patrol tactics from conservative law enforcement officers in the second-largest Republican-dominated state are notable, and Florida media took note. A Florida Phoenix article about the meeting carried the perhaps overstated headline, quote, "Florida sheriffs rebel against Trump's DeSantis' mass deportation efforts." One member of the council who wasn't present for the meeting, Sheriff T.K. Waters of Jacksonville, promptly came out and pushed back, saying he fully supported DeSantis, Trump, and ICE. And the hubbub was sufficient for Judd to call his own press conference the next day, where he also reiterated his support for mass deportation of immigrants who commit crimes. But even as he sought to downplay any differences with state and national leaders, Judd continued to emphasize that he thought undocumented immigrants who are living and working in the state without causing any problems should face lesser penalties than arrest, detention, and deportation. He suggested that instead they could face civil fines, mandatory language lessons for those who don't speak English, and requirements that their children be enrolled in school. The latter an especially interesting call given proposals in some southern states to bar undocumented students from public schools altogether. Here's a clip from that press conference.
They came here illegally. They violated the federal law, but it's a civil violation. Currently, they have no criminal history. They're not committing crime. They're employed. They're not on government assistance. They're not creating problems. Their children are in school. They need to be required to speak English through a program. There needs to be evidence of positive community integration into our society. But those people who are adding to the American dream and enjoying the American dream that came here illegally, I might add, but they're doing good and they're not a drag on society. They're, in fact, helping society. We need to find a path for them.
Sheriff Judd went on to offer an example of a person he has encountered and to spell out more of what he personally thinks should be required of undocumented immigrants.
But one illustration that I give, there's a lady that's about 40 years old. She was brought here illegally as a teenager by her parents. She's married to an American. She works. She doesn't violate the law. She has no criminal history. She's not currently violating any laws. She's adding to society. That's not the problem person. There's millions of problem people we need to be dealing with. Our conversation yesterday focused on a path forward for those that are here doing what's right other than being illegal. Set up a system. You waive any further due process if you don't comply in 5 years with learning to speak English. You're not taking any government handouts or money. You're working. Your kids are in school. You're socially interacting in the community. Then, if you meet these standards, that you can move up to the next level. Why is that necessary? Because the way our system's designed, we can't get 18 million people out of this country anyway. So we need to set a priority and focus on the ones, which is what we're doing, by the way, and let me underscore that, which is what we're doing, is focus on the ones that are a drag on our society.
This kind of talk about law-abiding undocumented immigrants used to be fairly mainstream, even among conservatives. In 2006, in a nationally televised address on immigration reform, President George W. Bush outlined a number of steps he thought the country should take to limit unauthorized entry to the country and secure its borders. But he also said this, quote, "I believe that illegal immigrants who have roots in our country and want to stay should have to pay a meaningful penalty for breaking the law, to pay their taxes, to learn English, and to work in a job for a number of years. People who meet these conditions should be able to apply for citizenship," unquote. Bush's push for a bipartisan immigration bill foundered on opposition from his party's right flank, which was increasingly turning toward the kind of nativism and racism now embodied by Trump and the MAGA movement. It is vanishingly rare these days to hear any conservative politician talk about undocumented immigrants in any terms other than punitive. But the reality is that outside the relatively narrow confines of Trump's base, most Americans are much more in line with the views expressed by Judd and his fellow sheriffs and chiefs. A Gallup survey last year found that support for immigrants overall had hit a record high, with 79% of respondents saying immigration was a positive thing for the country. And that extended to those here illegally. 78% supported, quote, allowing immigrants living in the U.S. illegally the chance to become citizens if they meet certain requirements over a period of time, unquote. And only 38%, about the same level as Trump's current approval rating, supported deporting all undocumented immigrants. Combined with rising concern about ICE and growing opposition to the construction of large new immigrant detention centers, which we've detailed here in recent weeks, the Florida sheriff's statements, however carefully couched, are another indication of flagging support for the mass deportation program. Meanwhile, in the seemingly endless right-wing search for minorities to demonize for political gain, some Southern conservative legislators have circled back around to a frequent target of recent decades: Muslims. Muslims make up just about 1.3% of the U.S. population, and in most southern states it's less than that. Among our region's states, only Virginia exceeds the national average, with a Muslim population of about 2%. But that extreme minority status can make Muslims an attractive political target. There are few places in the South where Muslim voters constitute enough of a force for pandering politicians to worry about, especially compared to the larger groups of voters who can be motivated by religious or ethnic bigotry. The current surge in anti-Muslim rhetoric among our lawmakers picked up steam last year with the election of Zohran Mamdani as mayor of New York City. As a Muslim, a naturalized U.S. citizen, and a progressive politician, Mamdani is practically custom-tailored to ring MAGA alarm bells. And Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville has been more than happy to ring them. When Mamdani was sworn in as mayor in January with one hand on a copy of the Quran, Tuberville posted on social media, quote, "The enemy is inside the gates." He repeated that same phrase in a post about the inauguration of Virginia's new lieutenant governor, Ghazala Hashmi, the first Muslim elected to statewide office in the South, and the first Muslim woman elected statewide anywhere in the U.S. And again on March 12th, Tuberville posted, quote, "The enemy is inside the gates," as a caption with a photo of Mamdani and others seated on Muslim prayer rugs. Tuberville is currently running for, and is heavily favored to be, the next governor of Alabama, a state where the 2020 census counted only 23,550 Muslims, about 0.5% of the state population. But not too small a group for Tuberville to single out. He has supported a push by conservatives in Homewood, a suburb of Birmingham, to block the relocation of a private Muslim school. As the New York Times reported, the Islamic Academy of Alabama has existed for more than 30 years and is well regarded for its academics. It's among the state's highest performers on achievement tests and has graduation and college acceptance rates near 100%. But when it sought to acquire property to expand its operations last year, an anti-Muslim grassroots campaign led local city leaders to block the plans. Tuberville posted on social media, quote, "The only place this Islamic Academy should be moving is out of Alabama. Islamic indoctrination centers have no place in our state," unquote. Tuberville's most likely Democratic opponent for governor, former Senator Doug Jones, has called the senator's Islamophobic statements vile and racist, and said, quote, "We have seen this before. Dog whistle rhetoric for political gain, and we need good people from all across the political spectrum to stand up and counter this," unquote. But Tuberville is hardly alone among Southern conservatives. Last month, Republican Florida Congressman Randy Fine responded to a satirical post by a Palestinian New Yorker about dogs being unclean by posting, quote, "If they force us to choose, the choice between dogs and Muslims is not a difficult one," unquote. And here in Tennessee, Republican Congressman Andy Ogles has been on an anti-Muslim tear. On March 5th, he posted, quote, "America and Islam are incompatible. Time for a Muslim ban," unquote. He followed it March 9th with another post saying, quote, "Muslims don't belong in American society. Pluralism is a lie," unquote. Ogles is proposing legislation to block immigration from majority Muslim countries. Both Fine and Ogles have faced backlash from Islamic groups and Democrats, with American Muslim Advisory Council and Metro Nashville's Immigrant Caucus calling for Ogles' resignation. Ogles' district, which includes part of Nashville and reaches out to more suburban and rural counties, is notable because it has 40,000 Muslim residents, one of the largest Muslim communities in the South. American Muslim Advisory Council Executive Director Sabina Moyadin said in a press conference that Ogles was wildly misrepresenting his own constituents. She said, quote, "The Muslim community consists of doctors and educators, parents and students, business owners and cab drivers, immigrants and those who have been here for generations. But most importantly, we are proud Tennesseans," unquote. But Republican leaders in Congress have been reluctant to call out their members for their plainly discriminatory language and policy proposals. House Speaker Mike Johnson of Louisiana shrugged off questions about Ogles' comments, saying they merely reflected what he called, quote, "a lot of popular sentiment that the demand to impose Sharia law in America is a serious problem," unquote. But of course, it is not a serious problem. There is no demand to impose Sharia, strict observance of Muslim law, in the United States. Certainly not from Mamdani or any other elected Muslim official, or from the Muslim residents of Alabama, Florida, or Tennessee. In fact, as we discussed here last week, the only organized push to create theocratic rule in this country is coming from the right, in the form of Christian nationalism. Last October, we talked on the podcast about a report showing the health impacts of gun violence in Tennessee and its relationship to the wide availability of firearms here. Last week, another report came out that approaches the subject from a different angle, economics. The Boyd Center for Business and Economic Research at the University of Tennessee has created a dashboard, linked in the show notes, to track gun violence data in the state. It breaks down information by race and gender and other demographic metrics, as well as by county and cause, homicide or suicide. And it has a tab dedicated to the economic impact of Tennessee's gun deaths. In 2023, there were 1,622 firearms fatalities in Tennessee, 54% of them suicides, 41% homicides, and 5% accidents. The dashboard assigns each of those deaths an economic impact based on their age and other demographic information. It estimates that those deaths meant $3.56 billion in lost productivity and activity statewide in 2023, which comes out to a cost of $510 per person in the state. It can, of course, seem cold-hearted or ghoulish to talk about gun deaths in terms of dollars and deficits. The dashboard is clearly aimed at business and political leaders across the state, speaking a language that perhaps resonates more deeply with some of them than appeals to empathy. It is a joint project of the UT Center and the bipartisan gun safety group Voices for a Safer Tennessee. The dashboard has been promoted by Republican former Senator Bill Frist, a physician, who said this on Instagram.
Did you know firearm tragedies cost Tennessee $3.6 billion over the past decade? For the first time, a new interactive dashboard from the University of Tennessee's Boyd Center and Voices for a Safer Tennessee shows the economic and human toll of firearm deaths and injuries across all 95 counties. The data reveal a troubling trend. Firearm deaths in Tennessee had increased about 60% in 10 years, and the impact reaches both rural and urban communities alike.
That last point is clearly visible on the county-by-county map, which shows that the highest gun fatality rates are in a mixture of urban and rural areas, most of them characterized by high poverty rates. In general, homicide rates are highest in urban counties, and suicide rates are highest in rural counties. You can see much more on the dashboard. I just wanted to mention it because it's a creative use of data to illuminate a serious issue, and because what it illuminates is the actual toll of gun violence on the state. Okay, now we're to my interview with Peter DeCarlo and Keeve Nachman, who are scientists at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Nachman is the Robert S. Lawrence Professor in Environmental Health and Engineering at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. He has more than 20 years of experience conducting research and teaching in the field of food systems, environmental health, and risk assessment. DeCarlo is a professor of environmental health and engineering in the Whiting School of Engineering. He has over 2 decades of experience measuring and understanding atmospheric air pollution globally. Together, they're engaged in a project to map out and identify toxic chemicals in one of the most polluted areas of the country, Louisiana's Cancer Alley. We've talked about Cancer Alley on the podcast before. It's a stretch of the Mississippi River north of New Orleans that is dense with petrochemical plants and oil refineries, more than 150 of them. It has long been identified as a hazardous place to live for its local residents, about 40% of whom are African American. Studies have shown that the risk of cancer in the corridor is 95% higher than the national average. But with so many plants emitting so many different kinds of pollutants, it has been hard for scientists, much less residents, to understand what people are actually being exposed to. That's where Nachman and DeCarlo's study comes in. Using a mobile lab, they collected and analyzed air samples all along the 85-mile stretch. And what they found showed that actually things are even worse than previous studies have indicated. So I wanted to talk to them about the study, their findings, and the implications for public health in Louisiana and beyond. I personally found their work really interesting and promising in how it can help people understand what's in the air that we breathe. So, Seth, let's go to the tape. All right, Professors Nachman and DeCarlo, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So we've talked about Cancer Alley here on the podcast in the past, and obviously it's an area that's been the subject of a lot of interest and a lot of study over many years. So people may have some familiarity with it, but can one of you maybe start out by just describing in broad terms, like what do we mean when we talk about Cancer Alley? What is it? Where is it?
I can take a stab from kind of why the industrial activities there kind of helped coin that name for the area. So about 25% of the U.S. petrochemical production happens in the stretch of Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. There's over 200 facilities listed in the toxics release inventory, which keeps track of these large industrial sites and the chemicals that they emit and where they emit. And so this concentration of activity means that there's a concentration of environmental harm and exposure to the population who lives in this same area. And so because of all these additional chemicals that come in from the industrial facilities, the risks for health impacts are much larger. And I come at it from a measurement side, and Keeve brings the kind of health risk calculation side. So we team up to really try to get this from the chemical understanding and the health understanding.
So I guess what initially got both of your attention? I mean, you may well have been aware of Cancer Alley in general, but what brought it kind of onto your radar as a place where you thought there was something that you could do, some gaps that you could fill, and that it was, something you wanted to focus on?
I think one of the things that got us focused on this particular area is even with what we knew about the industrial facilities there just wasn't a lot of hard data on what the situation was on the ground. And so as a measurement person, I'm very interested in, if I go and make a measurement, what does it tell me? And there were no measurements to compare to. And so that kind of lack of information was very appealing to go and find out more, especially given the concerns that have been brought forth by communities in that area for so many years.
Yeah.
Even if you use the limited tools that the government has available to assess what conditions are like in terms of air pollution in that area, there were red flags all over the place. The levels of pollutants, even from those models, were very high. And recognizing the limitations of those government models, they source a lot of their information from the emitters themselves and take that information and model it into what they believe is in the air. And we know there's an inherent conflict of interest in reporting those emissions. So we thought there'd be tremendous value to go out there with actual instrumentation and figure out what's really in the air, and not just what's in the air, but what does it mean for people who live there day in and day out and have to breathe those pollutants.
Yeah, that's one thing I thought was interesting, was that so much of the information that did exist was literally coming from the polluters themselves, sending a report to the government saying, here's how much pollution we're putting up, right?
Yeah, and even with that, as Keeve pointed out, they were still one of the top most polluted places in the U.S., even with the self-reporting. So we expected to see high levels, and we saw even higher levels than what was modeled with those tools.
Yeah. So I guess, can you talk a little bit about how you did that? I know you built a mobile lab, essentially, right? I mean, is this kind of like is it a van? Is it a truck? Like, what is it, and what did you do with it?
So we've been down a few times. The first time we went down, we were actually partnered with a company, Aerodyne Research, who I've worked with over 20 years now. They develop instruments, but they also are scientists who use those instruments. And so while they were building our mobile lab, which we now use, we were using their mobile lab and their state-of-the-art instrumentation to go and drive around. And it's the vehicle that they were using is what I would call a small truck. The vehicle that we now have, I would say, is more like Amazon delivery van sized. So it's not quite as big. But the key is you basically have a chemistry analytical lab sitting in the back of this vehicle that's making continuous measurements as you drive and giving you real-time feedback. So we're getting information on what we're seeing outside as we drive along and making measurements at kind of 1 second resolution, which gives us this spatial information to understand, we go by this facility and these chemicals go up. We go by a different facility and other chemicals go up. And so we can see differences in what's being emitted and link those to the various areas where people are living.
And then was it a matter of did you do multiple trips up and down, different days, different times of day, all of that kind of thing?
Yeah. So we base the measurement procedure off of doing the same trip, the same route over and over every day. And as you pointed out, we don't want to drive the same time every day. We want to make sure that we cover all hours of the day. And so we'd offset the start time of that trip, which is about an 8-hour drive from start to finish for the mobile laboratory. We'd offset that by an hour or two every day so that we covered every hour of the day. And so over the course of a month, we drove the same route many, many times. And we were able to build up statistics to see what are the average concentrations that we're observing over that month that then go into the health calculations that the risk team does.
Right. So then you're kind of collecting all that information and you're sending it back to Keeve, right? So then, Keeve, what did you do with it?
Yeah, so my job is to translate what we measure into the air into some estimation of how likely people are to get sick via a range of diseases. And we do this for cancer, and we do this for effects other than cancer. And so, what Pete is doing is, I don't want to flatter him too much, but it's super cutting edge, and we rarely have access to data of this spatial and temporal resolution in regulatory measurements. So I wanted to think really carefully about how we traditionally would interpret those data and all the limitations into how we normally would do it. And I wanted to do something better. So there's this movement in our field called cumulative impact assessment. And the idea behind that is we know that people tend to encounter lots of different chemicals all at the same time. And beyond chemicals, we also recognize that there are other stressors in people's lives that may also be related to their ability to endure the chemicals and maybe be resilient in the face of those exposures. And so we wanted to adopt an approach that at a minimum accounted for how this complex mixture of chemicals that Pete was measuring had impacts on the body. And so what we did that was kind of transformative is the way we normally regulate chemicals is we look at all the evidence that the chemical may affect different parts of the body. And our hope is that we identify the most sensitive part of the body that is affected when the chemical is inhaled. And so the idea there is, take a chemical like formaldehyde. Formaldehyde, there's good evidence that it affects up to 10 different organ systems in the body, but the one that's affected first when you start breathing it is the respiratory system, right? And so traditional approaches to regulating chemicals would be, let's pick that most sensitive organ system and regulate the chemical based on the level that would elicit that effect. And in doing that, we protect against all of the effects. And if we were only exposed to one chemical at a time, that would make good sense, right? The problem is when we have a mixture of tens or hundreds of chemicals all acting on the body at the same time, we're not only worried about that most sensitive target in the body, because there are so many chemicals acting on the body simultaneously, we're worried about all of them and all the places they go. So our approach takes into account all the different chemicals that Pete's able to measure in the air and all of the different targets in the body that each of the chemicals is capable of affecting. And we compile all of that together, and we're able to provide a more holistic description of the impacts of that mixture of chemicals on populations than a normal traditional risk assessment. And if you stack the results of a traditional one next to the results of ours, we find elevated risks of a number of different health outcomes that would be completely missed if we were to do things the traditional regulatory way. And the reason that's important is that if we find risks where the normal approach would not, there could be a valid justification for intervening to protect people from those exposures.
Right, because, I guess the way we often hear about the safety of different, or safety thresholds of different toxins or pollutants is sort of parts per million or parts per billion, but it's always of one particular toxin, right? And so what you're talking about is trying to account for all of the different things. How do you do that? Like if you have 12 or 40 or 100 different things people are being subjected to, how do you start to estimate the combined impact of that?
Pete, did you want to say something?
I wanted to interject because I learned all this risk stuff on this project. And I think an easy way that I've cleared this analogy with Keeve at one point is like, if you want to lose weight and the doctor says you need to stay below 1,000 calories of pizza per day, you need to stay below 1,000 calories of cheeseburgers per day, you need to stay 1,000 calories below donuts per day. So you eat 900 calories of each of those and somehow you're still gaining weight, right? Like, we have to understand the holistic exposure. You have to stay below a certain number of calories of all of those combined, not one of them individually at a time. And so this has been a fascinating project for me, learning all this risk stuff and trying to understand, for me, we've always been measuring all these different chemicals because we're interested in what it does for air pollution or climate change. But now we have this really great collaboration with understanding the health impacts in a much better way than was previously done. So I think we're pushing on so many different fields right now with this work. It's just really exciting.
And I like Pete's analogy, although it makes me hungry. So we're just starting to scratch the surface on this cumulative impacts thing. So we're doing a better job than has been done before with trying to understand the effects of these mixtures. What we're hoping to do in the future is to try and understand how some of the other stressors, like inadequate nutrition, lack of access to medical care, psychosocial stress, all of those things can have biological consequences that render people more vulnerable to chemicals. So the frontier for us is to try and understand that, and not just for the sake of improving the science, but these are real people that are affected, and a huge part of our motivation is improving the conditions for people who have to experience this day in and day out. So it's our hope that in better characterizing what this means for people and their livelihoods, we can advocate for changes that will protect public health.
So I guess what have you found? I mean, I'm sure you were expecting to find a lot of pollutants, but what have you found that surprised you, or was it worse than you expected it to be?
And from a measurement perspective, I think we expected the levels to be higher than what were being modeled. That's a pretty common thing in my over 2 decades of making measurements now that we almost always see. I think the piece that worries me the most, or that gives me the most pause, is the resulting health impacts from that. It's a place called Cancer Alley. If you look at the government models, they suggest that cancer rates are going to be higher, the risk is higher. And then we find concentrations and therefore risks for cancer that are often 10 times higher than what's even modeled. And so for a place called Cancer Alley, based on the pre-existing model data, which we knew was insufficient, to find on the ground risks being that much higher, 10 times higher in some cases, is just a sobering result, and something that we're worried about how to reduce those risks for the people who live there.
Yeah, and Keeve, what did you think once the numbers actually started coming in?
It was an affirmation that our concerns about the adequacy of government models to really characterize what people are experiencing was not there. It was how do I want to say this? It reaffirmed the value of the work that we're doing and the need for better monitoring in communities, especially those that are in the shadow of large-scale industrial processing, and an urgency for changes to minimize the exposures that these people are incurring.
To what degree have you been able, because there is such a concentration of all of these different plants and refineries down there, are you able to identify the particular sources of particular things in the air, or is it sort of too much of a soup to say, if this particular plant could only, reduce their emissions of this particular thing, that could make a big difference?
Sometimes and sometimes no is the answer. But because a lot of the chemicals that are being produced by these plants are specific chemicals, if we see a specific chemical that is a product from one plant, we can pretty much link it to that. And so one of the first papers we published on this area, we were focused on ethylene oxide because that is a chemical that has a very high cancer risk. It's not well measured and there's a lot of uncertainty. And during the Biden administration, there was legislation that was put in place to regulate the emissions of that and a few other really carcinogenic hazardous air pollutants. So we focused on that. And in some parts of our measurement domain, there were a few plants that were all making ethylene oxide. And so it was hard to distinguish which of those plants was leaking. But in one part, there was only one plant that was making it. And so when we drove around that area and we saw elevated concentrations, it was pretty clear where it was coming from. And you can do that with the other 65 or so hazardous air pollutants that we measured, and link those to known emissions from those plants or known products from those plants. And so in many cases, we can, using these kind of exotic manufactured chemicals, link to a specific plant, but not in every case. And some there are common pollutants that are sometimes emitted by multiple facilities, and you just have a more difficult time disentangling which facility is responsible for that emission.
And so I guess, well, first of all, I should ask, is this study complete? Are you still, are there further phases to it?
Yes. We are furiously working on a follow-up paper to the cancer risk paper that we published in 2025, which encompasses all of the health impacts, the organ system health impacts that Keeve was mentioning, and a higher resolution look at the cancer risk. And so one of the key things is the government model that we were comparing to, which I don't want to trash the government model structure because I think it's right. And I think Keeve was 100% right in pointing out that the emissions, the self-reported emissions are very likely to be the problem there. They went to a higher resolution output from census tract level to census block level. So essentially census blocks make up a census tract. And so we have better spatial resolution now that we can compare to and look at those even more highly refined cancer risk estimates compared to that government model. And so we've got a paper we're working on and hope to get out in 2026, encompassing all of those results.
And I guess, how do you foresee this being used? I mean, obviously this information can be made available to the plants themselves, to the state government, the federal government. I know we actually just talked about ethylene oxide on this podcast a few weeks ago because we were talking to the Southern Environmental Law Center, which has a lawsuit against the Trump administration because it is issuing exemptions to those regulations for ethylene oxide. So I guess, how is this information being used, or how do you hope it can be used? Yeah, Keeve, go ahead.
I feel like now's a tricky time to ask and answer that question because I think we are in the midst of one of the most openly deregulatory administrations in American history. But I look at this time as a time to generate the evidence that can be used when that window of regulatory intervention reopens. And I'm confident that it will. It's long overdue. We were really encouraged to see the rule in the previous administration that put restrictions on ethylene oxide and chloroprene emissions. Those are two very potent carcinogens that likely have huge public health consequences, especially in Cancer Alley. That the implementation of that rule has been delayed indefinitely. So I think when things change, not only will we have our cancer numbers that we've already published that Pete's talked about, but I think one of the main messages is it's not just Cancer Alley. There are many other non-cancer effects that add to the total population health burden that we would estimate. And we believe a better understanding of what people are enduring makes a stronger case for real regulatory change. I think it's important to be cognizant of where that change is going to come from. I think at the federal level, we stand the best chance to really make progress in that domain. Yet to see a real willingness to better protect the citizens at the state level. One thing that they've done in recent history is they've actually put a law in place that makes it harder for citizens to do their own air pollution monitoring with heavy fines to kind of prevent people from doing it. It's had a real chilling effect. So I'm very hopeful, but I think we got to wait for that window.
Let me add to that. I mean, I think your question was about how we can use the data to advocate, and I think Keeve hit on some key points. Like at the federal level right now, we're really at a standstill. But I think getting the information out there, getting it out in the public domain, in the discourse, is really important. And I will say that there's local groups in Louisiana that have reached out to us and asked, hey, can you package the information you have in your peer-reviewed scientific publication in a way that we can advocate in our parish? And so there's a lot of parish fights right now where people are coming forward and saying, hey, we don't need any more facilities, and this is the current state of the science telling us what our risks are for cancer. If you want to build another plant that's going to increase that risk, it's already beyond what it should be. And so we're able to package those results at the local level to help communities advocate with now data. It's things they've been saying for decades, but now they have the data to support their position. And so I think that's one of the ways that this information being out there is being used and being helpful for people on the ground.
And I guess just to kind of wrap up, do you foresee either by you or other teams of researchers this model being something that can be replicated elsewhere in terms of both the kinds of measurement that you're doing, but then also, looking at the cumulative impact model that you've been developing here?
We are actively looking at other places to do this type of measurement and build out. I mean, I think the cumulative risk piece that Keeve's team has really pioneered started in a pilot project that we did in Pennsylvania, and we only had 35 chemicals in the framework at that point. We went down to Louisiana and found, because of the size of the industry down there, the number of things that were being produced, we added 30 more chemicals that we found while measuring down there to that framework. So everywhere we go, we can keep building out more information into this model that can then be used by other researchers as well.
And Keeve, do you foresee that becoming a more prominent part of public health and how this kind of thing is looked at and assessed?
Absolutely. There's been really terrific receptivity to our new approach for making sense of chemical mixtures and considering the cumulative effects of breathing all those chemicals at the same time. We've been in conversations with interested persons at regulatory agencies in some of the states to try and figure out how can they take our approach and adapt it. And we've been really careful to, make the methods that we use as reproducible and transparent as possible so other people can pick them up and use them. And we are engaging with some of them now to show them how we're doing it. So I'm excited that we may be able to influence future regulatory policies around consideration of chemical mixtures in health.
All right. Well, thanks to you both for taking the time to talk about this. I think it's really fascinating work, and I'll put links in the show notes to some of the publications and the various summaries of your work that are out there. But thanks again.
Happy to be here.
Thanks. Yeah, really appreciate it.
This weekend is one of the best weekends of the year in my hometown here in Knoxville, Tennessee. It's the Big Ears Festival, which runs from March 26th to 29th. Big Ears started in 2009 as the project of concert promoter and music fanatic Ashley Capps, who previously co-founded the successful yearly Bonnaroo Festival in Middle Tennessee. Since selling his company to the Live Nation entertainment conglomerate in 2020, he has focused his energy on Big Ears, now a nonprofit organization and one of the best-known festivals for adventurous music in the country. Throughout its history, the festival has straddled lines of musical genre, culture, and tradition. It leans toward performers who could be called explorers in one way or another. This year, that ranges from marquee names like Robert Plant and David Byrne to jazz legends John Zorn and Pat Metheny, to the 8-hour Ragamala, an immersive performance of South Asian classical music built on traditional Indian ragas. Those ragas are being performed in St. John's Cathedral, an Episcopal church built in 1892 in the Romanesque style. It's one of more than a dozen venues, large and small, that the festival occupies across downtown during the weekend. Most are within short walks of each other, although a bus also makes the rounds. Besides the opportunity to see a staggering amount of great music packed into 4 days, the other thing I love about Big Ears is the way it is integrated into the fabric of the city's lively downtown. You can walk from theater to museum to church to nightclub to Celtic pub and find music everywhere, as well as plenty of places to pause for food and drink. I guess I should mention that my wife previously worked for Big Ears, but I was a fan before, during, and after her time there. Anyway, if you do happen to be in town for the festival, I also recommend stopping in at the Pilot Light, a small independent music club. It runs its own counter or complimentary programming to Big Ears, with 3 full days of local bands. And unlike Big Ears, it's free. And that wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit enterprise, and you can find information about supporting us on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. You can also reach out to me directly at jmayshark@theprogressivesouth.org. Thanks to our friends in Bark for our theme music, and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. We'll talk to you soon.